Ma'am, you're not on the list. You need to leave. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced, sharp enough to cut through the soft violin music drifting across the candlelit ballroom. And just like that, the air shifted, conversations paused mid-sentence, champagne glasses hovered mid-air, and every pair of eyes slowly turned toward the woman sitting alone at table 17. Jada Sterling didn't look up right away. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't frown, didn't flinch. She simply sat there in a fitted black dress, simple, elegant, unbranded. The kind of outfit that didn't beg for attention but somehow demanded it anyway. Her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the table as if the moment belonged to her and not the man standing across from her with a clipboard clutched too tightly in his hands. I've checked twice, he added louder this time, emboldened by the silence gathering behind him. There's no Jada Sterling on the guest list. A few guests nearby leaned closer, whispers rising like a slow ripple. Probably a plus. One who got lost, someone muttered. Another voice, softer but sharper. Or just walked in. A bridesmaid near the head table glanced over, lips curling into a polite smile that didn't quite hide the judgment in her eyes. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, offering them to every table except hers, skipping over Jada like she was invisible. Like her presence didn't quite register as valid in a room dressed in silk and expectation. And still, Jada didn't move, didn't argue, didn't reach for her phone or her purse. She just lifted her gaze slowly, meeting the man's eyes with a calm that didn't match the tension building around them. A calm that felt deliberate, like she'd seen this moment before, like she'd been here in different rooms, under different lights, with the same assumption wrapped in different words. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, she said quietly, her voice steady, not loud, not defensive, just certain, and that certainty seemed to irritate him more than anything else, his jaw tightening as he glanced around, suddenly aware of the attention, the audience, the subtle pressure to prove he was in control of the situation. Ma'am, he repeated, firmer now. I'm going to have to ask you to stand up. A second man approached, taller, broader, wearing the neutral expression of someone called in to handle a problem that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Security. The word didn't need to be said out loud. It was already understood, already hanging in the air, heavy, expectant. A few guests shifted in their seats, some curious, some uncomfortable. One woman across the aisle raised her phone slightly before lowering it again, unsure, and somewhere near the back, a quiet voice whispered, "This doesn't feel right." But no one said it loud enough to matter. Not yet. The music faltered for half a second, barely noticeable, then resumed, softer this time. Like even the band sensed something unfolding beneath the surface. And at the center of it all, Jada Sterling remained still, composed, her eyes moving once, briefly, scanning the room, the stage, the floral arrangements, the lighting, the details, as if she knew them intimately. As if this wasn't just another wedding to her, but something else entirely, something deeper, something no one else in that room had realized yet. And just as the security guard took one step closer, reaching toward her shoulder, the lights dimmed slightly near the stage. A microphone clicked on, and a voice, the groom's voice, cut clean through the tension. Before we continue. The groom's voice did not just interrupt the music, it redirected the entire room, like someone had quietly taken control of every breath in the ballroom. Forks paused mid-air, conversations dissolved into silence, and even the security guard's hand hovered inches from Jada Sterling's shoulder, frozen between action and hesitation. The groom stood at the center of the stage, one hand gripping the microphone, the other slightly raised as if asking the room for patience. But there was something else in his expression, something tighter, more deliberate, like this moment had been waiting for the right second to unfold. There is something I need to address before we go any further, he said, his tone calm, but carrying across the room with a weight that made people straighten in their seats. A few guests exchanged glances, confusion flickering across their faces, because this was not part of the program, not part of the carefully planned timeline printed on cream-colored cards at every table. This was unscripted, and that made it dangerous. The wedding planner near the back stiffened, her tablet held close to her chest, as if she could still control what was happening. But control had already shifted, subtly, invisibly, and no one seemed to realize it yet except one person, Jada Sterling, who remained seated, her gaze now fixed on the stage, calm, steady, almost expectant, as if she had been waiting for this exact interruption. The man with the clipboard cleared his throat, attempting to regain authority. "Sir, we are handling a situation over here," he called out, gesturing toward Jada, as if presenting a problem that needed to be solved. Quickly and quietly. But the groom did not look at him, did not acknowledge him. His attention remained locked forward, scanning the room slowly, deliberately, like he was choosing his next words with precision. "Some of you might be wondering why there is a delay," he continued, his voice softening just enough to pull people in, to make them listen instead of react. "And some of you have already made assumptions about someone in this room." A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Shoulders shifted, eyes darted, and a few guests instinctively glanced back toward table 17, where Jada sat alone, still composed, still untouched by the tension that seemed to grow around her like a tightening circle. The bridesmaid who had whispered earlier now looked down at her glass, suddenly very interested in the reflection of the overhead lights. The server who had skipped Jada's table adjusted her tray, her grip tightening slightly, as if she had just realized something she could not undo. The security guard slowly lowered his hand, not fully stepping back, but no longer advancing either. Caught in a space where certainty no longer existed, the groom took a small breath, the kind that signaled a shift from surface to substance. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that cut through every remaining whisper. "Before I stand here and make vows about love, respect, and commitment," he said, "I need to make sure we understand what those words actually look like." The room went still, not just quiet, but still, like something deeper had settled over it, something that demanded attention, not out of force, but out of truth. And in that stillness, Jada Sterling tilted her head just slightly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, as if the moment she had anticipated was finally stepping into the light. The groom's gaze shifted. Then, slowly, intentionally, moving past the front tables, past the guests dressed in tailored suits and polished dresses, until it landed directly on her. And for a fraction of a second, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, respect, something the rest of the room had not yet earned. "Because tonight," he said, his voice steady, "there is someone here who deserves to be acknowledged before anything else happens." A murmur began to rise, soft, uncertain, like the first sign of a storm forming just beyond the horizon, and across the room, people leaned in, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the feeling that whatever came next was going to change more than just the direction of the evening. And at table 17, surrounded by distance, silence, and every assumption that had been placed on her without question, Jada Sterling did not move, did not react. She simply waited, as if she already knew exactly what name was about to be spoken. Jada Sterling. The name did not explode across the room. It settled into it. Heavy, deliberate, impossible to ignore, and for a split second nothing happened. No applause, no reaction. Just silence stretching tight across every table like a held breath that no one knew how to release. The groom kept his eyes on her, not the crowd, not the staff scrambling to understand what they had just heard, but her, as if saying the name was not the point, as if what it represented was still arriving, slowly, inevitably. A few guests blinked, processing, searching their memory for recognition that did not come fast enough. Others leaned toward each other whispering, "Who is that? Do you know her? Why is he saying her name like that?" The bridesmaid who had smiled earlier now looked pale, her confidence slipping into uncertainty as she replayed the last few minutes in her head. The server near table 17 lowered her tray slightly, her eyes fixed on Jada, as if seeing her for the first time instead of looking through her. The man with the clipboard shifted his weight, suddenly aware that the situation he had tried to control was no longer his to manage, not even close. The security guard took a small step back, not instructed, not told, just instinct, as if something invisible had changed the rules in the room without asking permission. And still, Jada Sterling did not stand, did not wave, did not acknowledge the attention now gathering around her like a spotlight she never asked for. She simply held the groom's gaze, calm, steady, the the same quiet certainty she had carried from the moment she walked in, as if the name being spoken was not a surprise but a confirmation, something that had been delayed, not denied. The groom took one step forward, closer to the edge of the stage, his voice lowering slightly, but somehow reaching further. "I want everyone here to understand something before we continue tonight," he said, his words measured, intentional, like each one had weight behind it. "Because what just happened in this room matters more than the ceremony we are about to have." A ripple moved again, stronger this time, less confused, more uneasy, because now people were not just watching, they were realizing, slowly, that they had been part of something they did not fully understand, and that realization was uncomfortable. The wedding planner took a step forward as if to intervene, then stopped, her hand hovering near her tablet, unsure whether stepping in would fix the moment or make it worse, because the moment was no longer fragile, it was unfolding, and no one could pause it. The groom continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "Some of you looked at her and decided she did not belong here," he said, not accusing, not shouting, just stating. "And somehow that made it land harder, deeper. Some of you ignored her, questioned her, even tried to remove her from this room." The words hung there, undeniable, and across the ballroom, faces shifted, eyes dropped, shoulders tightened, the truth moving through the crowd not as a shock, but as a mirror, and mirrors are harder to face. At table 17, Jada Sterling finally moved. Not dramatically, not for effect, just a small adjustment of her posture. Her hands coming together lightly on the table, as if acknowledging that the moment had arrived, not because she needed it, but because everyone else did. And somewhere near the back, a quiet voice whispered again, softer this time, "Who is she?" But this time the question carried urgency, not curiosity, the kind of urgency that comes when people realize they have misjudged something important. The groom lifted his chin slightly, his gaze still locked on her, and then, with a clarity that cut through every remaining doubt, he said, "She is not just a guest." And the room leaned in without realizing it, pulled forward by something stronger than interest, something closer to consequence. And in that suspended second, before the rest of the truth could be spoken, Jada Sterling allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch her expression, not pride, not satisfaction, but recognition, as if she had seen this exact moment play out long before anyone else in that room even noticed her sitting there. She is not just a guest. The words settled heavier than anything spoken that night, and this time the silence that followed was different. It was not confusion anymore. It was tension sharpening into realization. People were no longer wondering what was happening. They were starting to understand that whatever they had assumed just minutes ago was already collapsing beneath them. The groom did not rush the moment. He let it breathe. Let it stretch just long enough for every eye in the room to return to Jada Sterling. No longer passing over her, no longer dismissing her, but studying her, searching for something they had missed, something that had been there the entire time. "She is the reason this wedding exists," he continued, his voice steady, unwavering. And that was the moment the shift became undeniable. A few gasps broke through the stillness, quiet but sharp, like glass cracking under pressure. The bridesmaid who had whispered earlier took a step back, her expression tightening, as if the ground beneath her heels had suddenly become unstable. The man with the clipboard blinked twice, his grip loosening as the authority he had relied on slipped away without warning. The server near table 17 lowered her tray completely now, no longer pretending to be busy, no longer able to ignore what was unfolding in front of her. "Every detail you see," the groom said, gesturing subtly around the ballroom. "The venue, the arrangements, the experience you are enjoying tonight was made possible because of her." The room reacted this time, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a wave of quiet shock that moved from table to table, whispers rising again, but different now, no longer dismissive, no longer careless. Now they carried weight, urgency. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "That is her." Chairs shifted, bodies turned, and suddenly table 17 was no longer the emptiest table in the room. It was the center of it, the place every glance returned to, the place everyone wished they had approached differently just moments ago. And still, Jada Sterling remained exactly where she had been, composed, grounded, her expression unchanged except for that faint, knowing calm that had never left her, as if none of this surprised her, as if she had already seen the outcome long before anyone else realized there was a story unfolding. The security guard took another step back, this time fully, creating space where tension had once been. The man with the clipboard opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped, because there was nothing left to say that would not sound small compared to what had just been revealed. The groom's gaze moved briefly across the room, not accusing, not calling anyone out by name, but making sure the message reached everyone. And yet, he added, his voice lowering slightly, she walked into this room tonight and was treated like she did. Not belong. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. And across the ballroom, faces shifted again, this time inward, reflective, uncomfortable, because now it was not about her identity. It was about their actions, their assumptions, their silence. A woman near the front table placed her hand over her mouth, her eyes fixed on Jada as if replaying every moment she had chosen not to speak. The bridesmaid looked down, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to regret. The server took a small step toward table 17, then hesitated, unsure whether approaching now would fix anything or only highlight what had already happened. And at the center of it all, Jada Sterling finally rose to her feet, not quickly, not for effect, but with the same calm precision she had carried all night. The movement alone was enough to still the remaining whispers, to draw every ounce of attention back to her. And as she stood there, no longer overlooked, no longer questioned, but fully seen, the room understood something all at once, not because she said it, not because she demanded it, but because it was undeniable now. She had never been out of place. They had simply failed to recognize the place she held, and that realization settled over the room like a quiet verdict that no one could argue against. The moment Jada Sterling stood, the room did not just quiet. It recalibrated, like every assumption had been pulled out from under it and replaced with something heavier, something harder to ignore. Her chair slid back softly against the polished floor, the sound small, but somehow louder than anything else in the silence that followed. And as she straightened to her full height, there was no rush in her movement, no attempt to match the tension around her. She carried the same calm she had walked in with, the same composure that now felt less like patience and more like control. Her eyes moved across the room once, not searching for approval, not looking for apology, but observing, as if taking inventory of every reaction now unfolding in front of her. The man with the clipboard lowered his gaze first, his shoulders tightening as he stepped back half a pace, no longer leading, no longer certain. The security guard shifted his stance, hands now at his sides, his earlier authority replaced by something quieter, something closer to restraint. The server who had skipped her table finally approached, hesitant, a glass of champagne trembling slightly in her hand. "Ma'am, I am so sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but Jada did not reach for the glass. She did not respond right away, and that pause said more than any words could have. It stretched just long enough for the apology to settle into the space it belonged, not rejected, not accepted, simply acknowledged, and then left there. The bridesmaid who had laughed earlier stepped forward next, her smile gone, replaced with uncertainty. "We did not realize," she started, but the sentence faded before it could finish, because realization was no longer the point. It had arrived too late to change what had already been done. Across the room, guests shifted in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others watching Jada with a new kind of focus, one that carried respect but also discomfort, because respect earned after exposure always does. The groom remained at the edge of the stage, his expression steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, because this was no longer about the announcement. It was about what followed it, and Jada understood that better than anyone in the room. She took a single step forward from her table, then another, not toward the stage, not toward the crowd, but simply into the space that had once tried to push her out. And with each step, the room seemed to adjust around her, people moving subtly, instinctively, creating a path that had not existed before, not because she demanded it, but because they now understood it should have been there all along. And as she moved, a memory surfaced, not loud, not overwhelming, but clear, a ballroom years earlier. Different city, different faces, the same polished floors and soft lighting. She had stood in a similar room, younger, less established, holding an invitation that had been questioned 3 times before she was allowed inside. She remembered the way the room had looked at her then, the same quiet doubt wrapped in polite smiles, the same assumption that presence needed to be proven, that belonging required explanation, and she remembered something else too, the decision she made walking out of that room that night, that she would never again explain her presence to spaces she had already earned, that she would build rooms instead of asking for access to them. And now, standing here, in a ballroom she had helped bring to life, surrounded by people who had not recognized her until someone else spoke her name, that decision echoed back, not as regret, but as confirmation. She stopped a few feet from where she had been seated, turning slightly, so her presence was no longer confined to a single table, but held within the entire room. And for the first time since she arrived, she spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying without force. "You did not misunderstand me," she said, her eyes moving across the crowd, meeting a few gazes, passing over others. "You revealed yourselves." The words landed clean, not raised, not sharpened, but undeniable, and no one interrupted, no one argued, because there was nothing to argue with. The truth does not need volume to be heard. It only needs clarity, and in that moment, clarity filled the room, settling into every corner, every table, every person who had looked at her and decided she did not belong, until now. The words did not echo, they settled. "You revealed yourselves." And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke. The room held that sentence like it was something fragile and heavy at the same time, something that could not be undone once. It landed. Jada Sterling did not look away. She did not soften the statement. She simply let it exist, and in that stillness, the shift continued, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. The groom stepped down from the stage then, not hurried, not performative, just deliberate, closing the distance between himself and Jada as the crowd instinctively parted a little more, not out of instruction, but out of understanding, because whatever was happening now was no longer a disruption, it was the center of the evening. The ceremony had paused, but something more important had taken its place. The groom stopped a few feet from her, his posture respectful, not elevated, not above, but aligned. "I should have said your name sooner," he said, his voice lower now, meant for her but heard by everyone. And that admission carried weight, not guilt, not apology alone, but recognition. Jada met his gaze, calm as ever. "You said it when it mattered," she replied, and that was all. No extended exchange, no need for explanation, because the moment did not require more words. It required awareness, and awareness was already spreading through the room. The wedding planner approached carefully now, her earlier urgency replaced with caution. "Miss Sterling, we would like to make this right," she said, choosing each word with visible care. But Jada did not immediately respond. She turned slightly, her eyes moving across the staff, the servers, the coordinator, the security, not scanning for blame, but for understanding. "Making it right is not a moment," she said evenly. "It is a pattern." The sentence landed differently, quieter, but deeper, because it was not about tonight alone. It was about everything that led to it, and everything that would follow. The planner nodded slowly, absorbing it, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to learn. Across the room, guests began to shift again, but this time not away from her, toward her. A woman from one of the front tables stepped closer, her expression sincere. "I should have said something earlier," she admitted, her voice steady but low. And that single sentence sparked something else. Another guest nodded. "So should I." And then another, not loud, not coordinated, but real, the kind of acknowledgement that does not erase what happened, but refuses to ignore it. And Jada listened, not collecting apologies, not validating each one, just allowing the room to find its own voice, because silence had been part of the problem. And now, slowly, that silence was breaking. The server who had skipped her table returned again, this time not with hesitation, but intention, placing the glass gently in front of Jada without forcing it into her hand. A quiet offering, not an expectation. And this time, Jada gave a small nod, not acceptance of the past, but acknowledgement of the present. The The security guard stepped forward slightly, then stopped himself, choosing instead to remain where he was. His posture no longer defensive, but aware, and that awareness mattered more than any forced correction. The groom glanced around the room, taking in the shift, the subtle changes that had transformed the space without changing a single decoration. "This is what tonight is supposed to be about," he said, his voice rising just enough to reach everyone again. "Not just celebration, but understanding who we stand beside and why." The words settled differently now, not as part of a script, but as a reflection of what had just unfolded. And in the center of it all, Jada Sterling remained composed, present, no longer invisible, no longer questioned, but not seeking the spotlight either, because the point had never been attention. It had been recognition, and recognition, once earned in truth, does not need to be repeated. It simply exists, steady, undeniable. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, to reset, to move forward, it did so with a different awareness than it had before, not perfect, not complete, but changed, and that change, quiet as it was, carried more weight than any applause ever could. The room did not return to what it was before. It could not. Something fundamental had shifted, not in the decorations, not in the music that slowly resumed in the background, but in the way people held themselves, the way they looked at one another, and most of all, the way they looked at Jada Sterling, no longer as a question, but as an answer they had failed to recognize. The groom stepped slightly to the side, not stepping away from her, but making space, giving the moment back to her, without saying it out loud, because now it was clear, this was no longer his reveal, it was her presence that defined the room. Jada turned her gaze once more across the ballroom, slower this time, not scanning, not observing, but acknowledging. And there was a difference, because acknowledgement carries weight. It tells people they have been seen, not just for what they are, but for what they have done, and that kind of visibility is harder to stand in than invisibility ever was. The guest who had spoken up earlier held her gaze for a second longer, some with quiet respect, others with something more reflective, as if measuring themselves against the moment they had just witnessed. The bridesmaid who had laughed earlier stepped forward again, her voice steadier this time. "I was wrong," she said plainly, not dressed up, not softened, and Jada nodded once, not as approval, not as forgiveness, but as recognition, because accountability, when it is real, does not need to be expanded, it just needs to be stated. The man with the clipboard approached next, slower than before, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to humility. "Ms. Sterling, I made assumptions I should not have made," he said, his tone careful, deliberate, and this time, he did not try to explain himself further, he did not reach for excuses, and that restraint mattered. Jada met his eyes briefly, then looked past him, not dismissing him, but placing the moment where it belonged, in the past, because she was not there to collect apologies. She was there because she had always belonged there, long before anyone decided she did. The wedding planner stepped forward again, this time with clarity, not uncertainty. "We will be reviewing our entire guest protocol after tonight," she said, not as a promise to Jada alone, but as a statement to the room. And that mattered, because change spoken publicly becomes accountability, and accountability, once witnessed, is harder to ignore. The groom lifted the microphone again, but his voice was different now, not leading, not directing, but reflecting what had already taken place. "Tonight was supposed to be about a union," he said, "but it turns out it was also about a lesson." A few quiet nods moved through the crowd, not exaggerated, not performative, just real, and he continued, "Not about who belongs in a room, but how we decide that before we even know someone's name." The words landed clean, echoing what had already unfolded without repeating it, and in that moment, the ceremony did not feel delayed. It felt redefined, as if everything that came next would carry more meaning because of what had just been revealed. Jada took a small step back then, not retreating, not stepping away, but returning to a place that no longer felt isolated, her table no longer empty, her presence no longer questioned, and yet she did not seek the center. She did not move toward the stage, because she did not need to. The room had already moved toward her, in understanding, in awareness, in consequence. The server who had first apologized now stood a little taller, offering service to every table with a different kind of attention, not selective, not filtered, but consistent. The security guard remained near the entrance, but his posture had changed, not just physically, but in awareness, as if the definition of his role had expanded beyond enforcement into understanding. And across the ballroom, conversations resumed, but they were not the same conversations as before. They carried a different tone, a different awareness, a subtle shift that would linger long after the night ended. And at the center of it all, Jada Sterling sat once more, composed, steady, not elevated by the moment, but revealed by it. Her presence no longer invisible, no longer questioned, but understood. And as the music swelled again, filling the space that had once been occupied by assumption, one truth remained, clear and unshakable. She had not needed the room to change to prove her place in it. The room had needed to change to recognize it. The ceremony resumed, but it did not return to normal. It moved forward with a different weight, a different awareness that lingered in every glance and every quiet exchange. The music filled the room again, soft and steady, but now it felt like a backdrop instead of the focus, because the real moment had already happened, and no one in that ballroom could pretend otherwise. The groom returned to the center of the stage, his posture composed, but his tone carried something deeper now, something earned. "We continue," he said, not as a command, but as a transition, and beside him, the bride stood with a quiet expression, her eyes drifting briefly toward Jada Sterling, not with confusion, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if understanding had reached her in the same way it had reached everyone else, subtle, undeniable, and permanent. The officiant cleared his throat gently, adjusting his notes as if trying to reconnect with the script. But even the script felt different now. The words about love, commitment, and unity no longer sounded like tradition. They sounded like responsibility, and across the room, guests listened differently, not just hearing the vows, but measuring them against what they had just witnessed. Because it is easy to speak about inclusion, it is harder to recognize when it is missing, and harder still to correct it in real time. The vows continued, steady, sincere, but the atmosphere held on to what had happened, not as tension, but as truth. And at table 17, Jada Sterling sat with quiet composure, her presence no longer isolated, no longer questioned. And yet she did not lean into the attention. She did not shift her posture to claim space. She simply existed within it, fully, naturally, as if nothing about the moment had changed her. Only the room around her had changed. The server who had once passed her by now ensured her glass was never empty, but without hovering, without overcompensating, just consistent, just respectful. The bridesmaid who had spoken earlier returned to her place, her posture more grounded, her movements less performative, as if something inside her had recalibrated. And near the back, two guests who had whispered earlier now spoke in quieter tones, not about Jada, but about themselves, about the assumptions they had made, the moments they had overlooked, because reflection, once started, does not stay contained. It spreads, slowly, quietly, reshaping perspective in ways that cannot be undone. The wedding planner moved through the room with a new awareness as well, her eyes sharper, her attention wider, no longer focused only on timing and perfection, but on presence, on making sure every guest was seen, acknowledged, included, not just in seating charts, but in experience. And that shift, subtle as it was, carried more impact than any perfectly aligned centerpiece ever could. The groom reached the final part of the ceremony, his voice steady, his words clear, and when he spoke about partnership, about standing beside one another with honesty and respect, the room did not just listen, it understood, because it had just seen what those words looked like when they were tested, when they were real. And as the couple exchanged rings, a quiet applause began, not loud, not overwhelming, but sincere, layered with something more than celebration, something closer to acknowledgement. And when the officiant pronounced them married, the room rose, not just in tradition, but in shared recognition of the moment that had reshaped the evening. And as the music swelled once more, fuller now, brighter, guests began to move, to congratulate, to celebrate. But the energy was different. It carried awareness, intention, a quiet understanding that presence is not something to be granted. It is something to be recognized. And in the midst of it all, Jada Sterling stood once more, not because she needed to, but because the moment invited it. And as she stepped into the flow of the room, no longer avoided, no longer questioned, but approached, greeted, acknowledged, she did not change her pace. She did not adjust her presence. She remained exactly who she had been from the start, composed, steady, certain, because the truth had never shifted, only the room had. And as conversations formed around her, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, one thing became clear to everyone who had witnessed the night unfold. The most powerful presence in the room had not been the one that demanded attention. It had been the one that never needed to. The celebration unfolded around her, laughter rising, glasses clinking, music weaving through the room with renewed energy. But beneath it all, something quieter remained, something deeper, like a current that no one could see but everyone could feel, the kind of shift that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into memory, into perspective, into the way people carry themselves long after the moment has passed. Jada Sterling moved through the room without urgency, without hesitation, acknowledging those who approached her with a calm nod, a brief exchange, nothing excessive, nothing performative, because she did not need to claim space that had already been established. She simply occupied it, fully, naturally, and that alone changed how others responded to her. A man who had earlier avoided eye contact now stepped forward with a measured respect, introducing himself properly this time, not out of obligation, but awareness. A woman who had once whispered now spoke directly. Her tone grounded, her words thoughtful, not trying to erase the past but to move forward with clarity. And Jada listened, not collecting validation, not seeking approval, just present, just steady, because the moment had never been about being seen for the sake of attention. It had been about being recognized for what was already true. And recognition, once real, does not need repetition. It holds. The groom approached her once more. No microphone this time. No audience needed. "Thank you," he said simply. And there was no elaboration, no explanation, because the meaning was already understood. Jada gave a small nod. "Make sure the lesson lasts longer than the moment," she replied, her voice even, not instructive, but certain, and he nodded in return, because he understood that what had happened tonight was not something to be remembered as a dramatic interruption, but as a standard, something to carry forward, something to measure future actions against. And across the ballroom, that understanding continued to spread, not in words, but in behavior, the way people greeted one another, the way they paused before making assumptions, the way they chose to notice instead of overlook, subtle shifts, but real ones. The wedding planner checked in with staff more attentively, not just for execution, but for awareness. The servers moved through the room with equal attention to every table, not guided by appearance, but by presence. And even the conversations that filled the space carried a different tone, less surface, more reflection, because once a room has been confronted with its own blind spots, it cannot return to ignorance without effort, and most people, when given the chance to see clearly, choose not to look away again. As the evening carried on, the lights softened slightly. The music transitioned into something warmer, more intimate, and guests gathered closer, forming small circles of conversation and connection. But at the center of it all, not physically, but in impact, remained the moment that had redefined the night, the moment when a name had been spoken, and everything attached to it had reshaped the room. And as Jada Sterling stepped toward the edge of the ballroom, pausing briefly near the entrance, she looked back once, not to check if anything had changed, but to acknowledge that it had, not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. And that was enough. She did not need applause. She did not need recognition repeated. She had never needed the room to validate her place within it. She had only needed the room to see what was already there. And now that it had, the rest would follow. Because truth, once revealed, does not fade. It settles. It stays. It becomes part of the foundation people build on whether they realize it or not. And as she stepped out into the night air, the sound of the celebration continuing behind her, one quiet truth remained, clear and lasting. She did not raise her voice to be heard. She raised the standard for everyone who had witnessed her. And that standard would echo far beyond the walls of that room.